Hello, and welcome back to the Transform Wellness Podcast. I'm Dr. Bradford Perkins, a longevity and metabolic medicine expert. Today, we're going to dive into food cravings, what's really behind why we crave certain food, and how do we help heal. So we're going to talk about the dopamine reward system. We're going to talk about how different things incorporate into why we have issues with our reward system, including past trauma, fat shaming when we were younger, PTSD, how sugar hijacks our dopamine reward system, as well as how inflammation, obesity, and insulin resistance affects our reward system. And then we're going to talk about how to heal, which are with certain supplements, with supporting the gut and the brain. And we're also going to talk a little bit about TMS, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation. So when we talk about the dopamine reward system, this is buried deep in our brain. Dopamine is our neurotransmitter around reward, motivation, and reinforcement. So dopamine is initially released in an area of the brain called VTA, and then dopamine goes to several different places. It goes to the nucleus accumbens, which is our pleasure center that reinforces behaviors as pleasurable. It goes to our prefrontal cortex. This is where we have our executive function in our brain. But this also we can get control. So we have issues with impulsivity and control. That's in the prefrontal cortex. And also this area is with motivation. And lastly, the other area is two different areas called the amygdala and the hippocampus. Amygdala is with emotional context to triggers, and then the hippocampus stores experiences in memory. So dopamine goes to all these different areas in the brain. And then we have two different dopamine receptors. We have the D1 receptors, which are excitatory. So these are pursuit of reward, wanting. And then we have our D2 or inhibitory receptors. Those are just the opposite. They tell us stop, stop, stop. But what we're going to find out is the issues become some of these D2 receptors start to get down-regulated. So we have this bigger proportion of wanting a reward compared to inhibiting our body from wanting to get those types of rewards. And then there is something called the reward system deficiency. And this is when people have low serotonin and dopamine. We're going to talk about different reasons why this occurs. So the first thing we're going to just talk about is high cortisol. This is from usually a lot of stress that we're under, either emotional stress, physical stress. And today's world is just very stressful, from work to the news, our schedules, just lots of stress. And when our body just keeps getting hit with all this stress, all this cortisol, we start to down-regulate the dopamine receptor. So we have less receptors. So we have we get less of a reward when we eat something we usually enjoy, which can lead to anhedonia, low motivation, and even more intense cravings, especially for sugar or stimulating behaviors. High cortisol also reduces dopamine synthesis. So it depletes our mineral cofactors like vitamin B6 and magnesium, which reduces the availability to make dopamine, which is L-DOPA, converting tyrosine into L-DOPA. And also with high cortisol, we get prefrontal cortex suppression. So we get this less of a, saying, hey, we shouldn't eat this, and more of that primitive amygdala-driven behavior, that hedonic urge, like, I want to eat now, I want to get that food now. So cravings and compulsive eating is less inhibited, and this is from high cortisol. And then if we look back, even starting in childhood, there can be a lot of shame around food. Unfortunately, a lot of that comes from, parents and loved ones. So we start to feel judged, we can feel unloved, not safe, when those people that should be providing us, that love and safety as young children, we're not getting that. So that can cause disconnected body cues on when we should eat and what foods do. And then as people go into the teen years, they can use these sugar cravings as a form of rebellion. Well, I'm going to do what I want. Very common in those rebellious teen years and early adult years. But with all that, you can get reduced dopamine and elevated cortisol because of all this experience. And unfortunately, when things are kind of set into us as children, with neuroplasticity, kind of gets wired into our brain. So this becomes a lifelong pattern that's hard to break. And we're going to talk about ways to break that. Trauma or PTSD also is part of this. So the amygdala becomes hyperactive. So we get that hedonic urge, and that suppresses our prefrontal cortex, our part of the brain that tells us not to do things, that executive function. So that gets suppressed. So, people with trauma can also have chronic cortisol issues as well, and low dopamine. These systems just keep causing kind of the same base neurotransmitter issues. And then people in these situations tend to use food as an emotional regulation tool. As far as just obesity in general, when we more fat cells, with a diet, with that, just the repeated stimulation in the brain does lead to fewer receptors again, which leads to reward blunting like we talked about, and more food cravings. And then once we also have insulin resistance with it, that impairs dopamine production as well. So here we're going to talk about sugar and how addicting it can be as far as in the reward system. So when we are looking at, how much our reward system or dopamine spikes with certain substances, sucrose is table sugar, it's getting 150% spike. I mean, that's close to nicotine. Nicotine is in alcohol are very close, about 200%. Cocaine's a little higher, but you can see it's still pretty big spike, getting close to, an illicit drug like cocaine. That's about 300 to 400% spike. Amphetamines, different world, that's getting 1,000% spike. And that's why it's so hard to kick issues with amphetamine use. So it's the repetition, the chronic use of these different substances, not the intensity, that wires addiction. Inflammation. Most of us are living with a lot of inflammation. Our fat cells produce inflammatory, our gut does, but these inflammatory immune system impairs dopamine and serotonin production because it pushes our body towards producing not serotonin, but something called kyernic acid, which eventually becomes quinolinic acid. This is neurotoxic. So now you have lower serotonin, so more depression, and that neurotoxic, neuroinflammatory response of the quinolinic acid leads to more depression as well. And a lot of that inflammation also comes from the gut. So, leaky gut is a term you're going to hear often, and in some of my other videos talk about this, in the gut-brain axis. So, if we have gut inflammation, it affects our mood, it affects our energy, it affects our cravings. And also an imbalance in the microbiome alters neurotransmitter signaling. So with a leaky gut, it can increase insulin, increase ghrelin. Ghrelin's our hormone that tells us to eat more. It says we're hungry. And then it lowers GLP-1. Well, GLP-1s, that's the latest craze with Ozempic, semaglutide, and Mounjaro. Also does something called CCK, PYY, and leptin. So all those go lower. So you get this imbalance in hunger. What causes a leaky gut? There's many causes, but briefly, poor diet, stress, chronic infections, lectins. So some people do react to lectins, or they're part of foods. Pea protein is a newer trigger for leaky gut because it's micronized, and once we're doing all these pea protein shakes, it really can cause more gut inflammation if we're prone to it. Low stomach acid, so people that are always on a acid suppressing drug like a PPI, like omeprazole, pantoprazole, Protonix, that can lead to leaky gut. And lots of toxins exposure. Our food, our food can have toxins in them between molds in the food, microplastics, things like that. Insulin resistance. Now, this is interesting because insulin resistance can change how our body is processing glucose. So it downregulates a receptor called GLUT4, and so our body must rely more on GLUT1. But because of inflammation and other causes, we can't produce as much energy from that glucose. So, glucose is what makes ATP. ATP is the energy source of the cell. So, normally we should be making 32 to 36 packets of ATP per 1 glucose. But when we are getting into this GLUT1, and our body's over inundated with glucose, our body just can't use it. So sometimes that we will drop our energy in the brain. So maybe we're only making 2 packets of ATP. Now our brain keeps saying, "Hey, we're tired. We got brain fog. We need that sugar to keep going." So, people that are just like, "Why can't I control myself?" Part of it is due to the reward system. Part of it's due to just the energy in the cell, and your brain's like, "I need energy." So you're always, you eat that piece of candy, let's say, make the easiest, analogy here. Eat a piece of candy, and we get that spike. We feel great. About an hour later, we crash. We're like, "Oh God, we're tired again." Our brain fog's back. So now we need to keep eating something that has sugar in it, and it just becomes a whole cycle. So our body just thinks that we are in an energy crisis. So that addictive eating cycle just continues, and everything just snowballs. Insulin also regulates dopamine in the brain. So when there's insulin resistance, we're down-regulating dopamine. And it also helps with transporting amino acids into the brain, because amino acids are what our neurotransmitters are made from. So we have less tryptophan, which makes serotonin, and less tyrosine, which makes dopamine, into the brain. So we're just making less neurotransmitters. And then, so this is rehashing that, sugar intake can increase cortisol, then you get a sugar crash, and then you're eating again, and you're just cycling all day, and the end result is more inflammation. So now you got insulin resistance worsening, more inflammation, less neurotransmitters. Now the whole system's out of whack, and this can go on for years, and that's why it's hard to break the cycle. So when we're looking at the different neurotransmitters, if we're thinking, keep craving sugar, that could be deficiency in dopamine and serotonin. For having mood swings, that's more serotonin. For having lack of motivation, that's more dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. And when it comes to emotional eating, that's more related to serotonin and something called GABA, which is our soothing neurotransmitter. Genetics do play a role. These genes can be turned on and off with something called epigenetics. It's a different talk. But the genes I think of here are the COMT gene, because if you have a fast COMT, that can break down dopamine faster. MAOA gene breaks down dopamine faster. DRD2 is less dopamine receptors. And then MTHFR, it's a very common genetic SNP. It's about 50% of people. You just get poor neurotransmitter synthesis if you're not taking in a methylated B vitamin. Salt cravings can be similar, but also can have other causes. So salt cravings can be due to stress, but it could be due to low aldosterone or mineral loss. So you can have a low cortisol, which leads to sodium retention, and then you can have low ATP from dehydration and the electrolytes being depleted, so that can mimic energy crashes. So salty foods can also trigger dopamine, like we talked about. So how do we help with that? That's adrenal support, magnesium, adaptogens. That's what would help with salt cravings. So how do we heal the reward system? Well, first we need to either treat the cortisol or serotonin, or a combination of the two. So 5-HTP is an option. If someone's tired and flat all the time, SAMe is a great option. Magnesium can help. B6 can help. Those are just critical cofactors to make our neurotransmitters. If it's due to stress, we need to get that stress response down. Relora, which is a combination of magnolia and philodendron. Ashwagandha can be used. Rhodiola, But usually I'm going Relora first, maybe support the serotonin if they're tired of flat SAMe. If I think they need to have more calming, then I look more at GABA with L-theanine, also known as suntheanine. Once that gets settled and we need to go into the dopamine, then I'm looking at mucuna pruriens. I'm looking at Tecrin as another option. And if we need to get that inflammation down, omega-3s, curcumin are good options to lower inflammation. If we want to support the gut-brain support, the gut lining, L-glutamine is an option, zinc carnosine, resistant starch to increase our short-chain fatty acids. We want to support the microbiome with spore probiotics, Saccharomyces boulardii. The newest thing on the market, everyone's talking about Akkermansia, but if someone's not low in Akkermansia, it's not really going to work. So, usually just some general microbiome support. And if you want to get a test to see if you're low in Akkermansia, you can always get that done. If we think there's yeast involved, berberine, caprylic acid is a good way for yeast. And more repair, fiber and fermented foods help repair that gut microbiome. And if we want to get into the world of peptides, these are all oral. There's BPC 157, KPV, and lorazepatide. That's dealing with the immune system in the gut, healing the inflammation, and lorazepatide heals the leaky gut. Behavioral and brain rewiring, we think of mindful eating, somatic therapies. I really like breath work, deep breathing exercises, doing box breathing with a good belly breath of, a 4-second inhale, 5-second hold, 6-second exhale. Vagus nerve activation, there's different ways, singing, humming. There's vagus nerve stimulators on the market. Movement, music, connection to others, those are natural ways to boost dopamine. TMS also helps boost dopamine. Here in my office, I have a device called ExoMind, just hit the market. This is a way to non-invasively stimulate the prefrontal cortex to boost neurotransmitters, increase dopamine, calm the amygdala down, and it has been shown to be effective for PTSD, OCD, and food cravings. It also helps restore impulse control. So that's just in general TMS. ExoMind's one that's on the market. It's the newest one. There's other ones on the market as well. But I think this is going to be the next real frontier of medicine going forward, or ways that we can help heal the brain. Because truthfully, antidepressants, any prescription medication out there doesn't truly heal the root cause of what's going on. They're more band-aids helping move around neurotransmitters. But now we're actually getting down to how do we heal the system? That's the gut, healing the reward system with supplements, exercise, and what we just talked about. So, as far as a summary, cravings are survival wiring. It's not a weakness. I was just talking to a patient. She was very upset. She's like, why can't I just do mind over matter? Why can't I just get past this? And I said, it's because this is wired in our brain. There's physical changes, chemical changes to your brain that you just can't push through. We need to be able to address those one by one with the steps we were talking about. Childhood trauma, inflammation, gut health, insulin resistance, all impact the reward system. And healing is possible with a full body, full brain approach to get you to help heal everything. So thank you for your time. If you want more tips, please subscribe to my channel. Drop any questions you have in the comments, and I hope everyone has a great day.